Welcome. This is Unit 4, Lecture 4. We're now moving away from the artists that I've grouped generally under a large umbrella term of and into another large umbrella that we'll refer to as formalism. So not that it is a style unto itself, just as a way to help you organize. Think of these styles as being ones that emphasize form. So form is anything that contributes to the way something looks. So form or formal issues, formal elements, are the visual elements of line, shape, color, texture, pattern, rhythm, and the way that we organize things from the point of view of composition. So the styles we'll look at today: Cubism, Futurism, Precision. We're going to see ways that artists can manipulate those visual elements toward their own goals. So not that there is a lack of motion per se, but the artists we've looked at so far have been more involved with using color for the impact of expressive emotion. Now we're going to look at artists using as well. The big star, of course, on the slide here is Picasso, the founder of Cubism. We'll look at several of his pieces you know for the test: the Demoiselle d'Avignon, his Three Musicians, the version from 1921, and the painting Guernica. We're also going to look at a work that you want to know for the test, Leger's The City. We'll then turn our attention to Futurist style, and we'll see a piece by an artist who's best known as a Dada artist, but the painting that we'll look at of his first is really much closer to Futurism. Futurism was a style that began in Italy and was all about trying to capture the idea of motion. So Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase we'll look at from the point of view of Futurism. We'll see his work again, turn our attention just to the Dada style. I also wanted to share an American formalist style known as Precisionism, and both of the artists, well-known practitioners of that style, are named Charles Schiller and Charles Demuth. We want to know Demuth's I Saw the Figure 5 in Gold. We'll also look at synchronism, an American style of joining sound and music and color together, which is kind of interesting as well. Picasso is an artist that we often think of in terms of taking things apart and putting them back together in an odd way in his. Some people don't know that his earlier pieces really have far more to do with showing slightly exaggerated proportions, but figures that look like human beings with their limbs in the right places and with a kind of emotional focus on color. These are his blue period and period, pretty early in the 1900s. He then moves into what we're more familiar with, the idea of Cubism. So the images toward the left side of the screen, Cubist style, which is all about showing objects that you're observing. They did actually draw and paint from still life, from models, from observation, but what they would do is kind of fracture those images and show those subjects from multiple different points of view simultaneously. Now, this work very much is built on what Cezanne did in his painting, in those kind of cube-shaped brush marks, but also in Cezanne, in nature could be rendered as a sphere, a cone, or a cube. On the right-hand side of the screen, what looks like a collage is what we call synthetic cubist style, and that really did come from exploration with collage and began a more flat approach to cubism. Picasso changes, though, dramatically after the end of his interest in cubism. He goes back to this very solid highlight, shadow, very three-dimensional hue in the 1920s. By the time he hits the 30s, you could classify him as a surrealist. He's starting to make things that no longer feel as if they are broken apart in planes or cubes, but are formed in a more organic way, but still have this kind of sense of reality and reality merging together in the subconscious. By the 40s, he's also kind of merging surrealism with his own approach back to cubism, almost as synthesized form of those two approaches. The work of the 50s bounces back and forth between cubism and realism. The portrait at the top right is very much in the vein of what he was doing back in the blue period 50 years earlier. By the time we hit the 1960s, a full-on neo-expressionist style. Some of the paintings, particularly the one to the far right, look very much like the style that artists were painting in kind of the graffiti street style of the 1980s. So Picasso changed his style frequently, and sometimes even within this decade. This is the decade in which he passed away, the 1970s. And you see, again, he's really pushing that kind of neo-expressionist style with a little hint of Cubist as well. We also know that Picasso was one of the most prolific artists who ever lived. He is prolific not only in painting and printmaking, but these are sculptures that he created throughout his career. There are examples on this slide dating between the 60s all the way back to 1912. We also work on ceramic. Primarily, he decorated the ceramics as opposed to making the vessel forms himself, but still, there's ceramic work in the latter part of his career that's really pretty interesting to look at. I wanted you to have a chance to take a look at, though, the only known child prodigy in art. That painting that you left is a piece that Picasso created at the age of 8 years old. For an 8-year-old, the anatomy on that horse is incredibly good. He moves from that point in his career as a child to, in his teens, being able to imitate the real world exactly the way it really looks. Look at the highlight and shadow, contour, cross contour, and believable solidity in Conte on this piece. This is the thing you would do in a traditional art academy. You would draw from cast replicas in plaster, cast plaster replicas, to learn highlight, shadow, and three-dimensional form. He then starts to do copies of artists' work where you can barely tell the difference between him and the original. This is a copy of a painting of King Philip by Velázquez, and it looks just exactly like Velázquez. Picasso said later in his life, he made this one when he was 16. At the age of 13, he claimed that he was given the job of finishing of a bird in one of his father's paintings, and that his father quit painting at that point, put the brush down, and basically said, "It's up to you now." Picasso's father was an art teacher, and he interceded and got Picasso permission to submit a submission portfolio, entry portfolio, to the Art Academy in Barcelona. They gave him a month to finish the assignments for them to judge whether to accept him. He finished the work over the weekend. They told submission for entry was better than the work that the students were making who were graduating from the academy that year. So Picasso was the only true child prodigy, and I say that because he could do the work of a realist as a teenager, as a child, and that is evident. Never guess were the work of Picasso. If you're familiar with Cubism, this would never be in your mind as something that he was capable of doing, and this he was doing at the very end of the 1800s, before the turn of the century. How different is this? He eventually leaves Spain and settles in Paris. He is very much influenced by the work of Toulouse-Lautrec, as you can see here. His Paris phase shows very post-impressionist kind of approach. It feels like Toulouse-Lautrec or Van Gogh in many cases. He lived in Paris and moved. Friend of his who was a painting student, who was also from Spain, who was his last name was Casagemas, and Casagemas was a kind of tragic figure. He fell in love with one of the models that artists were hiring. They had a pretty passionate but brief affair. When the girl left him, he became really depressed. When it rolled around to the time of Casagemas' birthday, they held a party in a cafe, in a bar, invited all their friends, including the former girlfriend, the painter that she was now living with, and Casagemas, when he got up to give his speech at the birthday dinner, actually pulled out a pistol and shot himself. And this really deeply affected Picasso, and here you see his painting directly afterwards. This is sort of the funeral of, this is a portrait of Casagemas, and he's in This is a less well-known piece. This is The Funeral of, that looks a little bit like a painting by El Greco that really does kind of have that feeling of rising action moving upward in space. You definitely see, after Casahema's suicide, though, you see Picasso painting almost exclusively in monochromatic tones of blue. And so this begins his blue period. That lasts from about 1901 to 1905. Color palette for a year to more pinks and earth tones, the rose period. He then moves into the Cubist period, which is divided into the first half, the analytical Cubist period. The second half is the synthetic. We could then sort of categorize the other styles as the classic, rounder, more solid forms. The surrealist work takes over 30s into the 50s, then into that neo-expressionist style. Pretty remarkable. This is the work of the Rose period. At this point, he had enough money to move his studio to a location that was closer to a circus, so we see a lot of circus performers coming into the work as subjects. We talked in the lecture about Matisse, about the importance of this painting. Matisse was being collected and shown in the home of Gertrude and Leo Stein, expatriate Americans living abroad. Gertrude Stein was one of the early leaders of modernist forms of writing. You may have heard a famous quote by her, "Rose is a rose is a rose." She had kind of a oddly yet simple style. Gertrude Stein was someone who definitely could influence your career in a positive way because she a very wealthy background. She was holding these salons with her brother Leo that were showcasing the most cutting-edge artwork that was being made in, and the most influential people were attending. So to have Leo and Gertrude buying Matisse paintings was making Picasso feel like if he his work into their house, it could really help his career, could really benefit him. But they weren't buying his work, so Picasso came up with this really clever plan to offer a portrait of Gertrude as a gift. So that's how his work got into the same room as Matisse's portrait of his wife in Leo and Gertrude Stein's home. He worked on this piece for a long time. She complained about having to go to his studio to sit for it. And odd distortions. The face kind of looks like a mask. The nose is in profile, but the face is turned in 3/4. The eyes are different sizes and they're at different angles in height. The foreshortened hand seems like it's been squashed by a steamroller. There are a lot of very, very intentional distortions in perspective and rendering in this piece. So Picasso knew he had a chance to make something that was a landmark, that was going to show that he was a rival to Matisse in this new land of abstraction and modern painting. Picasso said of this, thinks it's a good likeness. In the end, she is going to look just like that. Kind of implying that his painting would be more famous than her actual face or image. Gertrude Stein, for her part, said this in a very Gertrude Stein kind of style: "For me, it is I, and it is of me, which is always I for me." Check her out, though, in a photograph posed with it, and you kind of get where he was coming from. Weird solidity and angularity and roundness all in one is sort of what she looked like at the time. So it's kind of a remarkable piece. That landmark moment to his most significant early piece to know for the test. This is the Damsel to Avignon. Now, if you didn't know better, you wouldn't know. Avignon was also the name of the red light district where there were brothels and prostitution happening in Paris at the time. So the implication these women are prostitutes. They were originally not 5 women together, but the 3 on the left pretty much match. The 2 women on the right in the original drawings were actually dressed in sailor uniforms. They were male figures who were in the brothel to kind of make their choice of the women to spend the evening with. So he changes them dramatically, and you can really see the change in faces. The 2 on the right have faces that feel much more mask-like than the others, and in fact they somewhat reference African masks. Picasso claimed that he was not influenced by African-style artwork, masks, artifacts of any kind. We know a lie because Matisse bought a sculpture and gifted it to Picasso when Matisse traveled to Morocco. Actually brought back several small cast metal sculptures and gave one to Picasso. We also know that Picasso wrote about that he had attended or had gone to museums and been influenced or had been interested in work that he saw in the museums. There's a collection of African masks that opened during the time that Picasso was writing about his museum trips. You can see him referencing poses, though, from the past, similar to Matisse. To the work we saw from the neoclassical artist. That's a painting, of course, by Ang of a Turkish bath, a harem setting that is sexualized for for a Western audience. We also, when you combine that with this, you can kind of see how Picasso's the new different cultures into a new synthesis of a new image going forward. This is an example that fits right analytical to synthetic cubism, but the first phase again of cubism is called analytical, multiple points of view rendered on the same surface. So you're seeing the top, the side, the bottom all simultaneously of the still life, violin, and guitar. This brings us to synthetic cubism. This piece is a guitar as well, but it's made of cut and pasted paper, and it has the suggestion of texture from a piece of wallpaper to imitate the texture of wood grain. That leads us truly to synthetic cubism, and these two pieces both on the same subject, the painting of this clearly is the synthetic style. It's painted, but it looks like cut and pasted paper. I just wanted to throw a reference to Picasso's love life. He definitely had multiple women in his life. He married a Russian dancer, and they stayed till her death. Meanwhile, he had multiple companions, some of whom became painters themselves. One passed away, he married his final lover in 1961. He lived until 1973. So there's some artwork that references the changes in those relationships. That is a design that he did as a representation of the death of Marat, kind of an interesting. This gives you a sense of the solidity, again, of the work of the 1920s, the strange surrealism. Check out that figure coming over the horizon, kind of a strange, gigantic monster threatening these kids playing on the beach. He also had really interesting things to say about what it is to be an artist. One of my personal favorite Picasso quotes is, "Every child is an artist, is how to remain an artist once you grow up." I also really like this one. We all know that art is not truth. Art is the lie. Realize the truth. So when you think about the idea of what a painting can be, now that we have the camera, we can exactly like the real world. We don't need that realist style so much. Perhaps what art can do now is move beyond just replicating the world. Isn't its function always, hasn't it always had the function of trying to tell us something about what it means to be human? It's a form of so he's reminding you that art is artificial, it's artifice, it's made up. But we can feel the reality and the emotion of that image, giving us a sense of what it is to be human. Think about how many times you've been upset by the events of a television. The ending of a series, maybe you didn't like how Game of Thrones ended, it made you angry. Well, why? It's just made up, right? But you invested time with those characters. They were real to you for the time that you were invested with them. That's another example of art not really being real, but it feels like it is. It has that impact. That brings us to Guernica. The piece to know here for the test is a very critical piece. It was originally meant to be exhibited in the Spanish Pavilion at a World's Fair, and then news broke of a really tragic event that had taken place. The Spanish were in the middle of a power struggle, civil war, and side you had General Franco, and Franco was trying to seize control through military action, but he didn't have the resources he needed, so he allied himself with Hitler, and Hitler and Franco cooked up a kind of a scheme where they would each other, they would become allies, but the requirement that the Nazis had was to allow them to do a kind of practice run, sort of a form of terrorism, of bombing civilian sites to gain control over a population. And so Franco offered them relatively small-ish town, Guernica. And so the Nazis bombed the city. It took about 3 hours. The city burned days. Essentially everybody who lived there was killed, and it was a scandal around the world. Picasso was working in Paris on painting for the Spanish Pavilion, which was a typical Picasso ego story. It was a painting of an artist, him painting nude women. And when this story idea completely redesigned the composition and came up with this image. It is not a black and white photograph, that is a color photograph. He's gray. And the texture in a lot of the lighter areas looks a lot like printed text from a newspaper, doesn't it? And it references of the synthetic cubist style for sure. But here he's showing us art being the lie that tells the truth. This doesn't look like a photograph of that event, but it allows you to deal with the emotional impact of what it would be like for a parent to be the body of a child, to see decapitated heads, severed limbs. It's not literal, but it allows you to ideally those emotions and face those concepts. You don't have to look at a photograph of the dead body to be able to be thinking about what those people were. So it is, strangely, not the real world. It's the lie that tells the truth. The piece that is rarely shown, that is a companion to this, at the end of the war, when it was revealed to the general public what was going on in Hitler's concentration camps, the gas chambers and the other horrors of the Holocaust, the painting at the bottom of the screen there is known as the charnel house. So he is a very deeply political artist. I'd just like to add in a little contrast here with Matisse. Matisse definitely felt the effects of the Second World War. He lived in Paris during the when the Germans occupied France. His daughter, Matisse's daughter, was a freedom fighter. She actually was captured by the Nazis to a concentration camp. When the war ended, she was actually saved. So Matisse would have had an emotional connection to the war, of course. I think what he chose to do was to emphasize the beauty of life, to show that life could still be good in the face of ultimate horror. The opposite of that, to show us the horror, to help us deal with it. I think in a weird way, they both gave us two different ways of coping with one of the most traumatic times in the history of the modern world. Also, of course, Picasso's work becomes super iconic. You may film Children of Men, in which some of the world's art that we've studied already, including this piece, are collected and preserved by the kind of government that's overseeing a world that's falling apart. It's interesting that that collection of art at the ministry includes the broken of the David, but also the wall that was graffiti tagged by Banksy, one of his most famous pieces, the cops kissing there. Of course, we've seen sort of the end of Picasso's career from the 50s to the 70s, this kind of surreal style merging with an expressive style. But I also wanted you to see these very interesting re-envisionings of other people's famous works. He, of course, as a Spanish painter, is fascinated by Velázquez. This is him at the end of his career repainting Velázquez style. I love the idea that his version, Picasso's, a self-portrait where he's miles tall. That's him there. Here's another version of that same idea. painted in a completely different way. There's the dog again, the Infanta, there's the figure in the doorway, there's the painter and the easel. Here are his variations on David's Death of Marat that we studied last unit, which finally includes Charlotte Corday stabbing him the majority of the space. And then his take on Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the female figure, kind of the most important focus is the man. Interesting approach. So we've already looked at similarities and differences between Matisse and Picasso. Remember, large difference between Cubism focusing on line and shape and Matisse and the Fauve style focusing on color. We talked about their exchange work on their careers. We talked about how their work influenced one another. We've already looked a couple times at this rivalry between the portrait styles, how Cubism was kind of a response in some ways to Matisse's subjects, how Matisse then changed his forms to be more solid in response to. We see Matisse's interest in pattern being kind of influenced by Picasso and vice versa. We certainly see them having a rivalry about this kind of Cubist, flatter, abstract style in the middle of their careers, changing from flat to three-dimensional, also in the middle of their careers, back to their home base, with Picasso sort of imitating Matisse's style for a time before swinging away from it to his signature broken, rearranged elements. Georges Braque is the other painter known for Cubism. He was sort of Picasso's partner at the time. Picasso, in a very egotistical way, made sure to kind of diminish Braque's contributions by referring to wife, which sort of de-emphasized Braque's contributions. We also have the style Futurism rising in the early years century. Italy. Futurism is an attempt to capture motion in something that can't move. A painting, especially, is not something that can move. So by see the multiple legs of this adorable dog walking on a leash on the top left in Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash by Giacomo Balla. On the right, you have young girl running on a balcony. You almost see through her as she goes past so quickly that you can see some of her feet and body kind of fading really solid, as if all of that action's taking place at once. We definitely need to think about the fact that people doing abstract styles don't, because they're trying to cover up for a lack of skill. That portrait at the top left is beautifully done, is very accurate. That's the work of the same person as the bottom. This is the work of Baccioni, an Italian artist who also wrote the Manifesto for the Futurist painters. Now, Manifesto we think of often as a lot of artists in the early 20th century wrote manifestos about their art styles, the sort of rules of what they were going to do, how their work was going to be made. So I've summarized some of the most important points of the Manifesto of the Futurists. Some of the things I really like is that they wrote against old statues, against everything that is corroded by time. They didn't want to make the art of the past. In fact, one of their conclusions in the Manifesto is to destroy the cult of worshiping the past art. Number 3, I love this, elevate all attempts at originality, which would, if it's new, it's better than the old. They definitely wanted to, number 8, to support and glory in the day-to-day world, to make the of the world you're in. What the image that you're seeing at the bottom right is a sculpture by Baccioni. It's a figure walking in space, moving quickly. Definitely seen in 2 different points of view there, combined together in one photograph. This image is head-on, head, shoulders, hips, thigh. And you can see the figure a little more clearly here. Again, it's armless, kind of in homage to Rodin. There's a thigh, knee, shin, pretty clearly. But look at these forms flowing off the body. It's almost as if that figure is walking into a really stiff wind. It really feels like it can move, even though it is, of course, solid and can't move. This is the work of Fernand Leger. Leger was one of the leading followers of Picasso's Cubist movement, who developed his own style, which even his friends called Tubism instead of Cubism, because they were such a round approach to use cylinders more than cubes. You can see that in the necks and arms of the figures here in the center, and even in the use of the poles and smokestack scene. This is Leger's The City of 1919. He's also credited with emphasizing the use of signage, symbols from advertisement and so forth as a precursor to the pop movement. This is the work of Duchamp, and Duchamp will come up again in a lecture on the Dada style, the art of nonsense, but I wanted to put him here with the Futurists and Cubists, so you got a sense of the fact that what he's doing is showing. This piece is one of his most important. It's called Nude Descending Staircase, number 2. It is one to know for the test. It was premiered in the United States at an exhibition known as the Armory Show in 1913. And this was a show that took place in a disused military armory, hence the name. The show actually toured. It went from New York to other cities. Most notably, it went to Chicago, where students at the art by how ugly and bad the art was. They even made copies of some of the pieces and burned them in the streets, if you can believe it. This piece is one that caused probably the most confusion among the audience members or viewers, and a critic in the New York Times referred to this piece as an explosion in a shingle factory. And it kind of looks like a bunch of brownish, rectangular-ish shapes flying all around in space. But it's meant to represent the idea of a female figure nude walking down a set of stairs. And I've shown this to students and had them say they can't see it at all. But follow the mouse here. Imagine that as an eyebrow to nose to mouth. That's the head. Think of this as kind of squared off section. That's our shoulder to elbow to wrist. There's our arm. There's the body tapering down to her waist. That zone would be the hips. There's her thigh to knee, down to the shin bone. And you see here these tracking lines that show the leg in motion, from the back of the calf muscle swinging around to the front of the shin bone as we step. And if you trace back, if you really look at the hips, you can see the hips repeating, 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 repeating. But especially if you look at that swing of the leg from the knee downward, you can see that swing here and here. I've included some arrows, that red area is pointing to the knee, is pointing to the lower leg. You really, if you break it down, can see the figure in there, but it does take a little work on your part. The American style of precisionism is one that definitely is celebrating the new and modern world. Now, ironically to us, when we look especially at these factories, they may trigger issues that you may feel about pollution, about the movement toward preserving and protecting the environment, of greenhouse gases creating difficulties around the world with global warming. But at the time that these were made, these paintings were very in celebration of this new industrial kind of power in the US. So the artists who made them considered these buildings to be very beautiful, but in the way that they showed American strength and resiliency. It's kind of an odd thing. Charles Sheeler was equally gifted as a photographer and as a painter, and his the other artist who's known for this style is Charles Demuth, and I wanted you to see a photograph of the source. Now, this was not made as a piece of art. This is a reference to the building that he's painting here. And you can see he's really strengthened and emphasized the lines, cleaned everything up. That's the heart of precisionism. And you can see in the photograph these vertical, or horizontal rather, lines going across the image at the top. Those are power lines, right? Electric lines. You see them here. But then what are these angled lines coming down? If you really look at it, quite obviously, that's rays of sunlight with hard-edged lines kind of highlighting them. It's kind of a fascinating way of making nature a little more formal. It's almost an American style of Cubism. The Demuth piece to know for the test is this one. It's I Saw the Figure 5 in gold. It's a very precisionist style painting, but it's also a very as well. It is based on a poem by William Carlos Williams, the American modernist poet. The poem was called The Great Figure, the number. The poem goes, among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded, gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. It's about a fire truck. Think about that shocking, an emergency response vehicle is coming up towards you from the distance, and the sound of the siren gets louder and louder and louder and then fades away as it further away from you, just like that number 5 is getting closer and closer to you and then passes past you. It's a pretty remarkable thing. The painting includes references to, there's Bill for William, there's Carlos, right? There's WCW for William Carlos Williams. There's the signature, very precision and style signature, CD, Charles Demuth. Pretty cool painting. This last example is the style of the synchronists. And these were American artists who were trying to do something completely new and very abstract. Their idea was to synchronize, combine color with sound. So they wanted the paintings to evolve in your mind over time, just the way it takes time to hear a piece of music. So it's about harmonizing the colors and causing this experience that would take time to look at, just the way it takes time to hear a piece of music. Morgan Russell on the left, Stanton McDonald Wright on the right.